So it's really exciting that Eva is here on behalf of the IRC. React and the IRC have met up, and you and I have been talking about some opportunities for collaboration between MIT and the IRC. I think for starters, this past January, IRC was a contributor of both content in the training that our students received in the online workshops. But now some of our students have begun internships with the IRC at Jordan. So it's an exciting extension of the program. I had a chance to visit the Mahali labs in Oman when I was there this past January, and it's an invigorating and challenging space. And I thought both their approach to innovation and design, as well as some of the projects that are coming out of the labs would be really interesting to the open learning and the general MIT community. But I'm not going to say more. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. So hello, I'm Eva Kaplan, and I'm with, as was already mentioned, I'm with the International Rescue Committee, and specifically with the Middle East Hub for Research and Development. And I'll get a little bit into what that is in a minute. But first, I said this already, but just a couple of you came into the room. I'm going to show you one of the prototypes that came out of the lab at the end. You don't have to download this. We can use my phone, but if you want to do it on your phone, if you download this app and then sign in with this username and password, then the power will be in your hands to look at the prototype. So okay, just to start off, the IRC, for those of you who don't know, it's a humanitarian organization specifically focused on people who have been displaced by conflict or another sort of crisis, natural disaster, things like this. So the mission is to help people who have been impacted by crisis survive, recover, and thrive, gaining control of their future. Airbell, which is the name of the department focused on research and development, was set up a couple of years ago with the recognition that although the number of displaced people is rising across the world, our sort of efforts to raise more and more money and to be able to use our traditional approaches to deliver for people in crisis, it's not going to be enough to meet the need. And so we need to focus a lot more on new ideas. And so Airbell was set up to be essentially the research and development unit within the humanitarian sector. So we look to develop life-changing and highly scalable solutions that meet the needs of people who are impacted by conflict and crisis. So you are all aware currently, I'm sure, that there are over 68 million people who are displaced. We are looking at, again, scalable solutions and focused on really three methodologies, although we do integrate, depending on the project, we'll integrate more as well. But the core of what we do is design thinking. So we spend a lot of time working with communities to understand what challenges look like from their perspective, how solutions will sort of quote unquote behave in the real world, things like this. The second methodology is behavioral science. And finally, we have an overall commitment to having evidence-based approaches and a high degree of analytical rigor. So we do incorporate a lot of data science as well into what we do. In general, all of the IRC's programs are committed to being either evidence-generating or evidence-based. So this is sort of the flavor of the organization. The Middle East Hub for Research and Development was set up just a couple of years ago, actually less than about a year and a half ago. And we launched with two projects. The idea of having a kind of regionally based hub was to be able to do a lot more sort of field-facing work, or really bottoms-up work. So one of these projects was the Mahali Community Innovation Lab, and that's what I'll focus on today. The Mahali is a co-working space, first and foremost. It's a physical space that's located in East Amman, in an area that is low income, and there is a sort of densely populated area with both refugees and Jordanians as well. The goal of the lab is to put people who are impacted by crisis in the lead of defining the challenges they face and coming up with solutions. So this is the sort of overarching principle. There are 3 hypotheses that we have in doing this lab. The first is pretty simple. It's that people who are impacted by crisis have the ability already to solve challenges they face. It's pretty simple. Of course, we know that people are already solving challenges they face every day. So one of our hypotheses is that there's something we can learn from this. The second is that those solutions that people who are impacted by crises develop, they will be different than what we would develop. Otherwise, there's not really a purpose. If they would develop the same thing we would develop, there's not really necessarily a need for a lab like this. And then finally, the third hypothesis is that those solutions will be more accepted by the community than something that the humanitarian community would develop. So through the work of the past year, of close to a year and a half of work from the Innovation Lab, I would say we can feel confident in the first 2, and the jury's still out on the third. So that's Mahali. But I'm going to take a step back for a second and talk about Jordan and the context that we're working in. So again, the Syrian refugee crisis has, I'm sure you're mostly aware of the dynamics of the past 7 years. About 7 years ago, there was actually 8 years ago now, there was a massive influx of people into the countries neighboring Syria. This includes Jordan, but also Lebanon, Turkey, and Iraq as well, less so. But there's other refugee communities in Jordan as well. There's a Yemeni community, Somali, Sudanese, Iraqi, Palestinian. There's a large population of refugees in Jordan, and it's actually a small country. So of the 9 million people who are living in Jordan, about 3 million are guests. So that it doesn't only include refugees. It also includes people like me, expats. But you can see the community is quite large. Speaking of Syrian refugees in particular, there are 680,000 about refugees who are registered with UNHCR. And the government estimates that, including those who are unregistered, there's probably about 1 million Syrians in Jordan. We're not totally sure of the real number there. But just to give you a sense of the scale. The other, often when you think of refugees, you think of camps. There are a number of refugee camps in Jordan, 2 which have a sizable population. But the vast majority of refugees don't live in camps. They live in the cities. So there's just a bit over 100,000 who are living in camps. So the challenge looks very urban, actually. So it's probably fair to say that for refugees, they prefer the cities. There's more choice, there's more freedom of movement, but there's also a lot of challenges. So for many Syrians who have been in the country for, let's say, 7 years, the restrictions on working, on accessing health services and things like this, they're still there. So you may have, gotten married in Jordan, had a child in Jordan, seen your child become to school age, but you are still under the restrictions that are refugees live under. So your life is going on, but you're in a pretty constrained environment. So that kind of points to the second challenge from a humanitarian perspective, which is the protracted nature of the crisis. So in urban areas in particular, and as the crisis continues, our kind of traditional approaches of service delivery are very difficult to reach people in the way that they need to be reached essentially. So its service delivery just looks really different in an urban context than it does in a camp context. And we as a humanitarian community really need to adapt our approaches. And we need to do it in a way that is really meeting the needs of refugees without really fully understanding all the time where they are in urban environments, what they're dealing with in the day-to-day way, and what tools they're using to solve their own challenges that we can kind of leverage. So this is the kind of context in which the Mahali initiative and having a community innovation lab becomes very important. So this is sort of the framing for the lab. And I sort of frame this in this big way of like, we're talking about 500,000 refugees minimum, and in urban centers, it might not be the case that we can solve all of these challenges with the Community Innovation Lab. Of course we can't. But what we do know is that every day people are already solving challenges that they face, and that there are likely particular individuals who are the major change makers in their communities. And the Mahali Innovation Lab was really set up to say, if we can support existing change makers, potentially their impact could be much greater than it is without our support. So this was sort of the reason to start the Innovation Lab. So Mahali was designed to get at some of these challenges. As a program, there are basically 4 phases. In the first phase, the phases are define, find, design, and deploy. In the first phase of define, we're not assuming we know what the challenges are that refugees are facing. We use essentially 2 design principles to define what challenges we're looking at. The first is to go where people are, and the second is to use their language. So we did a series of community breakfasts all around the country where we just listened. It was just storytelling. And we sort of synthesized these stories into some themes of challenges that people were facing. And then we did a pretty massive effort around the country to have people prioritize these challenges. Again, using the language that people use to describe them to us. And these were sort of described in cartoons. In terms of going where people are, our team went door to door. They went to shops. There was a pretty massive Facebook, a lot of people are on Facebook, Facebook outreach. So we had several thousand people ranking the challenges, and through that we selected 3 that we would run design sprints on through the Innovation Lab. And I'll go into those 3 in a minute. The second phase is find. So in find, we are basically saying, okay, there are 680,000 refugees in the country. Who are the best suited to solve this challenge? And we try to find them. So we have a pretty extensive application process. It starts lightweight, a written application. And then we have a series of events where we invite people into essentially a hackathon and see what their ideas are. From there, it's a 3-week boot camp where we're bringing people through a cycle of the design process. And from there, we choose, in different sprints, it's been a different number, but about 3 to 6 teams to go through into our the design phase. So this is essentially, this whole long process that I described, it's essentially an application process to get into the program. We have over 2,000 applications per cycle, and unfortunately that's for about 40 spots. So this has been the find phase is a very intense phase. It was much more of an intense phase than we had thought it would be in the beginning. The third phase is a design phase. So for these change makers that we've selected into the program, they enter a 10-week design sprint, which is a heavily facilitated process. And it includes some design, so understanding your user, designing user journeys, describing different stakeholders. There's also a lot of sort of more traditional desk research, let's say, getting evidence of what's worked in other contexts, things like this. And then there's a number of things around entrepreneurship, and there's a entrepreneurship bootcamp that's embedded within the design sprint. So finally, we go to deploy. And in the deploy phase, those ideas at the end of the design sprint, which we can consider a validated prototype with a promising pathway to scale, those prototypes and the teams go into a 6-month accelerator program where they develop their ideas more. So that's the program. I described it in some depth, and I obviously still glossed over most of the details, so I'm happy to answer questions if there's some pedagogical questions or anything like that. But I want to go a little bit into the sprints. We've done 3. We're currently in our 3rd one right now. The first one was on income. So it was framed essentially just how can we support or how can we ensure that that vulnerable populations in Jordan have enough money to meet their monthly needs. Very simple. From a humanitarian perspective, we very much thought about this as from the income angle. How do we get more income? But every single one of the teams looked at expenditures and reducing expenditures, which was very different than how we would have approached it. So our hypothesis that they would have different, even framings of the challenges and solutions was clearly the case. I'll just describe one, which actually gets both at income and expenditure, but in one of the teams, which is called Baitna, the solution was targeted at the expenditure of transportation. So in Jordan, there's a very few sectors where refugees are allowed to work. And those physical locations of the places that are of employment are far from places of housing. And minimum wage is $220 per month, and transportation can be about $140 per month. This is in JD. So transportation expenditure actually makes work not really worthwhile. So the solution is to find shared housing closer to the places of employment, and then help with transportation from there. So you're cutting out a lot of the transportation. There's, again, a lot of details about this around how the sort of who works in families and things like this that make it a very effective solution. We've seen that it increases the income by about 100 JD for the families or the workers that have been part of this till now, which is essentially doubling their income. So it's quite significant by reducing their transportation costs through a housing solution. So this is a team that's currently in incubation in the 6-month deploy phase. And I'm happy to go more into that because a lot of the details I've glossed over about why that's an interesting solution.
Can I ask questions at the end?
Yeah, or you can ask one now for that one, yeah.
No, in general, why do you think the teams pick this, saving expenses instead of bringing in more revenue? What is the reason you think?
So I don't know. I think that what I could hypothesize is that they're very clear that there aren't very many income streams for them, and that a lot of the solutions that would be focusing on income are illegal. And so that's just a closed door. So why would you focus on that? That's my sense. In the beginning, there were a lot of people looking at income, and they very quickly were like, none of these are going to work, which apparently we have not figured out yet in the humanitarian community. We're still very much focused on income. Yeah. The other thing that I wanted to highlight about this was that exactly what we kind of thought of, there are community workarounds already. People are solving issues on their own. And we have a lot to learn from that and help maybe turn it into something that's more formalized or scalable. That's exactly what happened in this case. The founder of Betna had been working at a mall. I don't know legally or not, but he found a bunch of people on Facebook that he could share housing with near the mall, which made it worthwhile for him to have that job. And so he said, this is what we're already doing. Let me make that easier. And so at first, in his first prototype, he just did it on Facebook, and he was doing the matches on his own. And now he's developing it into a more formalized solution. But it was exactly kind of the hypothesis was sort of really validated in this case. A lot of the informal things that are happening are not formalizable because they're not quite legal. So this is a challenge that we faced. Okay, the second sprint. Are there any more questions about the first sprint or the first solution, Betna? Yeah.
You're saying he's developing a more formal mechanism. Do people have to pay for that service?
No, not at the moment. It might be the case that so for his grand vision, he's also thinking about what happens when people are returning to Syria, and what kind of housing they'll need, and how this platform could also facilitate that. And I think if he were to expand, he would be looking at funding, but it's not clear yet whether he'll be looking at a sort of pay from the customers or pay from some more of the humanitarian funding.
Yeah, and then, so you said the solution, is the intention that each of these funnels leads to a single solution, or is it just that only one of them met your criteria of being potentially scalable and fairly viable?
Yeah, great point. No, we would love it if there were a million solutions out of every sprint, for sure. We're not only looking for one. In that sprint, we had two that came out. In the second sprint, we only had one out of 4 teams.
Yeah.
And part of that, I can get to the second solution now. The part of that is because of the solutions, and part of it is because our process isn't necessarily suited for some of the solutions. So that's been a challenge for our program, that we've had to kind of try and retailor what we're providing so that there are other pathways. So there's a lot of, I'll talk about some of the challenges at the end, but this is certainly one of them, is that it's not that there's only one solution necessarily that's viable, it's that the other ones we are not the right group to support necessarily. So the second sprint was on access to health services. We had, 4 solutions that came from this. One was viable, although 2 other ones were very, very interesting. And I think this one is interesting because it also started from a community workaround solution that was wildly illegal. And I did not think they were going to figure out how to make it work. Essentially, it's a medicine bank. For people with chronic illnesses, who have trouble accessing they need medication monthly. It's very predictable what they need, and they know they're going to need it every month. There's a lot of medicine sharing because the prices are too high to be able to purchase it every month. So what they wanted to do was essentially have a medicine bank. So if you had extra medicine, you could just bring it to the pharmacy and someone else could collect it. But of course, that's not going to work. There's some real protection issues there. So I was really unconvinced by this team personally. But what they ended up coming to, which I never would have imagined this would be the strength from a community-led initiative, was to figure out a partnership like this. What they figured out was that pharmaceutical companies produce in bulk. So they produce in 100,000 units or whatever, and they have to overproduce because they can't tailor it to exactly what the need is. So they overproduce every month, and then they have to spend money disposing, or however often they produce, they have to spend money disposing of the excess medications. And so their solution is essentially a supply chain solution for the pharmaceutical companies to get them to targeted communities who would otherwise not be able to purchase their medications. So these are discounted medications that are going to expire within 1 or 2 months, and it's going to the to people who need it. Yeah, it's a beautiful solution. And what's interesting about it is that the pharmaceutical companies are the most excited about it. So they actually really turned something that obviously made no sense into something that's like very good, nice solution. So Sprint 3, and I have the prototypes here for the one I'll demonstrate from this one. Sprint 3 is on education. Specifically, it's looking at how we can transform all environments that children would be in into learning environments. So this was the frame for the challenge. There's basically, we're right in the middle of the sprint now. We're in week 6 of the 10 weeks. And there's 2 kind of categories of solutions. One is support for parents and to support parents into teaching their kids. And the second is transforming public spaces. So playgrounds, actual street art, things like this, to turn sort of environments that children would be in into more creative, inspiring, collaborative environments. So I want to demonstrate one of the solutions, and then I think maybe I'll talk about the challenges in the sort of more question answer, because this is a little bit of a deep dive. But these are cards. One of our teams, this is a low fidelity prototype. So this is what you would see, something like this you would see in about, well, we're in week 6 now. So they're working more on their, developing the content more. But this was how they started. And now they're testing this a lot with the potential users of the product. So what this is, it's for parents who have deaf children. So for many parents who have a deaf child, they don't know sign language. They don't know how to learn sign language. They just are really ill-equipped to support their children in learning formal sign language. And so what happens often is that children, families kind of develop their own sign language, just informally. So it's a very informal sign language. And obviously, nobody else can understand it. So if children at some point wants to go to school, they are going to need to learn sign language. If they want to interact more than outside of their home and communicate actually outside their home, they're really not going to be able to, because they don't know formal sign language. So this is really targeted at parents whose level of education themselves is not very high. So it will work for parents who are not literate in Arabic. It's the idea is that it's just a game, but it uses augmented reality. So I'll pass these out. For those of you who downloaded the app, you can look at it, but for those of you who didn't, I can show you. On the inside, it's like a coloring card. But on the outside is where the augmented reality comes in. Did anybody download it? If not, I can just try and showcase it. Maybe that's easier.
What was the app? Sorry.
It's here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So essentially, this is a deer. They haven't actually done the videos, so it's a very blonde child that comes up, but they're going to do redo all the videos with. So it's just a deer running through a field. So for a kid, this is really fun. And then on this side, it's the sign and the vocal. So the parent, although they may not be able to understand the Arabic on the card, they can hear the word and know what the sign is. And the card also has the spelling instructions, so the letter instructions to spell the word. So that's the solution. And they're currently prototyping this with 50 families of deaf children who are between 2 and 5 to see what the impacts are as they're developing the content. The idea is that these would be available You can download them online at some point, and they're available in existing sort of child-friendly spaces where you can go and download the app on your phone, pick up the cards, and then when you get home, you don't need data. You can just work with it all like that. So this is one of our solutions from the current sprint.
What was the topic of the sprint?
This sprint is about transforming all environments into learning environments. So this one is focusing, of course, on the home environment. So the solutions really ended up with like support to parents and transforming these public spaces. Those are the categories that we're seeing.
So I had a question about the technology infrastructure, and it sounds like families need to have some kind of cell phone, smartphone, and what's the what kind of data can they expect to have, and what kind of access can they have to?
So certainly most families have smartphones. It might not be that everybody in the family has a smartphone, but there's typically every family has a smartphone. Data is a different story. It's obvious. I mean, we can see from the post-distribution monitoring of like cash transfers that it's highly, highly prioritized as a spending category, data. But this solution in particular, it shouldn't need data. You do have to download the content, but you can do it at a center. And then once you get home, you don't need data for it. Yeah. So it is the technology that availability or infrastructure that's required is the smartphone availability, and it's in this context it's pretty universally available.
It sounds like it's a high priority, like it's right up there next to food and water.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, food and water the rent is the biggest expenditure, and then this is prioritized, the phone. So communication and information access is highly prioritized, and that means the phone.
How long is the sprint?
The sprint is only 10 weeks, which has been a challenge. It might be the case that we would, if we were to replicate them in the future. This is our final sprint right now, that we might think about making it longer.
Are they getting any stipend or anything? They come in every day? How does it work?
Yeah, so they are required to come in every day in this, and they do get a stipend. We call it a scholarship. The language around that has been very important because in the beginning we called it just a salary, like you're formally hired. So that changes it entirely than if it's a scholarship. So that's something that that's definitely a lesson learned from this project. It is a little bit difficult when they enter the deploy phase. They still get a scholarship.
After the sprint?
After the sprint, yeah. The successful solutions go to a 6-month accelerator program. And entrepreneurship programs have an idea about, which I understand, the risk that's involved in entrepreneurship and how the entrepreneur has to have a stake in the game. And that looks very different when you're working with highly vulnerable populations. And so getting the balance right between incentivize or like enabling people to participate without creating perverse incentives has been really challenging for us. This is definitely one of our.
Can you get more in depth about that?
So basically, I think a sort of truism in entrepreneurship is that the entrepreneur has to be taking a risk, has to have something on the line, otherwise it's not going to work. But when you're working with vulnerable populations, what they have on the line is like their children's education, or when they're living sort of in this sort of very highly vulnerable environment, we can't really ask them to participate without covering their basic needs. And so our challenge has been to say, okay, we're ensuring that you can participate, and we're not creating a kind of dependency on our program rather than a passion for the project that you have. This has been a fundamental, or like a real tension in the program. Yeah.
Just addressing that
Yeah.
problem, because for most entrepreneurs, they are inventing something they're going to make money out of. Right?
Yeah.
It sounds like what you're talking about is that they're inventing things for the social good.
Yeah.
So they're not necessarily going to profit directly from, or is that? I mean, how does that discussion?
Yeah, so there might be some of them could certainly be profit making. So for example, this one could be. not probably for the most vulnerable, but one of their business model ideas that they're working on is something like Tom's Shoes, where they sell it to people who have money, and then for everyone that you buy, it goes to someone who's in need. And so you could think of that working because rich families have deaf children also, and also probably are not very well equipped to manage it. So this is a solution that could have a nice business model. Certainly in other cases, the solutions are non-for-profit solutions. So at our kind of demo day, as we call it, where we bring in investors and potential partners and things like this, some of who they're sort of pitching to is more of the nonprofit actors who would be able to fund the project or maybe even absorb the project. But this has been another challenge in the program because it's not an entrepreneurship program, and we don't really have very good pathways for people to be absorbed by an organization like the IRC or an organization like, for the learning ones, we're really looking at UNICEF. So that's something that we're working more on. And actually changing our whole model because of, yeah.
But would they be making anything? Like, let's say UNICEF's got this incredible idea, we're gonna buy 100,000 of these. So will the entrepreneur or will these fellows, will they be, what is the financial relationship there?
So they, for example, let's take a different solution. For example, there's one that's looking at playgrounds and developing sort of learning sort of games and things like this that would be in playgrounds that are targeted at early childhood development. So they have two different ideas on how a business model would come of this. One is to have sort of actually the products all could be made from recycled materials, and what you would be doing is working with the community to actually build the playground, and that would require funding for the whole thing, right? That's a service that these guys are providing, and that, let's say, a UNICEF or the municipality or whoever would be funding them as a community-based organization to do that. Their other business model is just to manufacture the playground equipment and sell them. So there are two, and we actually are not clear yet which is more viable. So those are the kind of two pathways.
But the people that are these, several refugees working in the space that are developing these ideas, so do they get financially something out of this after?
Yeah, if they were funded by UNICEF, that would go to them. Yeah.
So they own this idea.
They own the idea. So most of them, in this particular sprint, there's intellectual property involved. In most of them, there's not really. It's more of a service. But all intellectual property is held by the innovators, and they have lawyers who are consulting with them about the best way to do it. We of course push open source, but again, we don't make that a requirement because it's their solution. So they have to do what works best for them.
This is so exciting to hear about. I just have some questions about some of the nuts and bolts.
Yeah.
You talked about scholarship versus stipend, and I wasn't quite clear what choice you made in regards to that and how that was interpreted by the people involved in the teams. And the other question I had, I was just kind of curious, was sort of what it looks like brick and mortar, how you get these groups together, and is there a central facility, and how do you kind of, in real time work with these people?
So the stipend and scholarship, I mean, I can't totally say that this is the only thing that changed that created this, but definitely the scholarship makes it, we see the teams that are receiving scholarships being much more empowered to kind of push forward in a lot of different directions versus feeling more, let's say, closer to the IRC, and that they are as like employees of IRC, let's say. So they are much more like working with us to figure out where their solutions are going to go and this kind of thing. But that's not the only thing that changed. But the language of scholarship is definitely more in line with how we envision what we're doing. We're just providing the enabling space and technical support.
It's like you're making an investment in them.
Yeah, exactly. But they're not actually employees.
Mhm.
So the other when we were providing a stipend, we were actually hiring them on consultancy contracts for the IRC. That it just kind of changed the nature. The language is important somehow. The second one, the bricks and mortar of it, we do have a physical location where everybody comes every day. It is like in there are many of these, of course. I mean, there's many of these around here. There's many of them in Jordan as well. This is the only one in East Amman, which is a low-income kind of part of the city, and it's in a sort of an area that's densely populated with people who are impacted by the challenges. So a lot of what they're doing is leaving the lab and going out and like interviewing kids who are on the playground outside. Going the school that we're working with on the Transforming Streets one is like 3 blocks away from the lab. And so a lot of the principals around for this particular challenge, we've been doing a lot of outreach to schools. A lot of the principals who are around the lab have become involved as well. So the physical location is quite important for the work. Were there other questions about the bricks and mortar?
No, that's very helpful. It seems like it's really embedded in the community.
That's the idea, and we'd like to make that more and more the case over time, so that at the moment, the only people that come every day is those who are part of the sprint, but we'd love for people to come just to, check their email and things like this.
That was a question I had.
Yeah.
If you could talk a little bit about the composition of the teams.
Mm.
You talked about co-creation, right? So does that mean you bring in designers and other people when you talk about technical support to co-create with the refugees?
So we do have actually a designer on staff who helps them with the design tools and things like this, but I wouldn't quite call it co-creation. It's more of a training than co-creation. We do, my other work outside of this is to develop a sort of pipeline of ideas that are currently unsolved. And in that, we do also work with many of the people who have come through the Mahali program, and that is more genuinely co-creation, where we're bringing something to the table, they're bringing something to the table, and we're figuring out how to actually, in that case, the affected populations, we consider them the context experts. And we bring other expertise and skills, but that's really co-creation. Mahali is not really co-creation. It's really community-led and community implemented. So, we do bring in a lot of technical support, a lot of partnership, and we provide funding also for them to develop partnerships where it's required. In one case, there's actually the Medicine Bank team, which there's some data science involved in the supply chain solution and probably a technology platform as well. And that team is getting an MIT React fellow as an intern to work on their team as well.
So they're doing the sprint, then they're in a 6-month accelerator?
Yes.
And have you gone through that whole cycle?
No, we haven't. Yeah, we're all desperate to know what's going to happen. The other thing that we have a number of is called demo days. So we have one in Jordan. We actually have one in the UK as well. Which
flew them out there?
None of them can get visas, so it's a video link. But otherwise, we would have. Yeah.
And that's just to get feedback from staff in the UK, or?
No, this is to get funding. Yeah, so we bring the scale partners. So the natural inclination for things like this is venture capital, but because so many of our solutions aren't really for profit, either they could be for profit, but their main goal is social impact, or they're just not for profit. We're also bringing the sort of, the people, anyone who might fund it to get to scale. And the one in the UK is actually organized by the funder of the project. So it's the START network is that's what they're called. Yeah.
So in terms of like the demographics of the people who are participating as innovators in your program, are they kind of like, are they representative of the general population of urban refugees, or are they kind of like the elite, like, okay, we're already Facebook connected such that we would hear about this program and we are very literate and educated and have the ability to take 6 months off from whatever we normally do to do this thing? So.
Yeah, so it is, it's a difficult question to answer. Most people are Facebook literate. So we'd be hard pressed to find people who weren't. But there is a mix of skills. In Jordan, if you're a refugee, to a certain degree, your vulnerability is defined by your refugee status. And so we are looking for the people, most of our programs target the most vulnerable. This one, the only criteria is that you are impacted by the challenge. And of course, what we want to see is that you have an idea for a solution. So we're looking for change makers.
If they're illegally in the country, also not registered, you also take them?
Yes, yeah. We don't ask for documentation.
There's no problem with that?
No. The registration is, most of our programs don't ask for documentation. We also have Jordanians. We also have Somalis and Iraqis in the program. But it's certainly not, I mean, it's represented in the sense of like, well, it's only represented in male, female, I guess. But aside from that, there's not enough people in the program in any case. So there's, in this current sprint, I think we have like 30 people. So it's a very, I mean, you know, out of around 2,000 applicants.
What is the constraining factor there? Is it funding?
The level of support that we provide is quite intense. So Robert saw I spend a day a week with them giving one-to-one feedback. We have a designer that meets with them constantly. We have someone whose job it is to help them make connections. I mean, he does more than that, but that's like the most of his job. We have, as I said, sort of like a mentor and coach for every team. We have someone who is the sort of point person for the rest of us to say this team member needs that, this team needs more design support, this team needs. We have a researcher who helps them with evidence reviews, things like this. And it's an intensive amount of support. So it's not the most scalable program, I wouldn't say.
Would you say your focus, the most important thing here is the ventures in contrast to the people?
So that's an excellent question, and it's one that we grapple with all the time. We are, as we move forward, we're somehow splitting this program into two. One that is, I was describing this morning, one that is really focused on skills and developing the design research skills essentially, and the sort of, let's say, change maker skills. And getting a team, you can participate in this kind of like training program because you're interested in developing your own solution. You can participate because you're interested in working with me on some of the other initiatives through more of a co-creation type of project, or you can do it because you're just interested in learning these skills. You're thinking of, doing something different in the school that you work at or whatever. But certainly we do, it is intensive. We do provide funding to participate. To your point, is who can leave what they're doing every day. Most people are not doing much every day. And so this actually presents a better opportunity than some of the other things they might be doing. So in that sense, we are spending a lot of time making sure that we can enable participation. But so then really focusing on that part of like, as a training program, and then separating it from the solutions component. that's some of what we're thinking about now. So we're reaching the end of our funding for this grant, and now we're redesigning it so that we can think about what does this look like going forward. Yeah.
I have a niche question. It just basically relates to the work I do and how what you're doing might relate to it. I'm just wondering how much you use technology-enabled ways to facilitate learning and collaboration, whether you have project management applications that people can access from computers or tablets or phones. Do you do any kind of like online training, remote training from their smartphones, things like that? Just curious, because that's kind of what we do here. I mean, it's been great to listen to you, but I was just wondering, if there's any nugget that you use that you're finding really useful around that niche area.
So we do for our team. We don't do remote trainings, but we have a lot of materials that we've developed that, one thing that, especially for design tools in Arabic, there is a lot, but most of it's proprietary somehow. So one of the things we're doing now is a website to kind of publish all of our things. We have a design dictionary in Arabic and all this kind of thing. But we have not done remote training, and I think we've talked about it a lot. I don't think that it's going to be something that we're going to move forward with. Not because I don't think that it's a good idea, but because I don't think we're the best people to do it. Maybe I'm wrong, but however, a critical tool for us is Facebook. And we've had a lot of engagement on our Facebook page. So we live stream the pitching, and also we post opportunities on it. We all kinds of different opportunities, and there's just a lot of engagement on the Facebook page, and also WhatsApp. So a lot of the field work that the teams do, we're just sort of in constant communication using WhatsApp groups and things like this. So there's nothing fancy, it's just the normal kind of stuff. But they're critical also. And they're so underused actually for what we do. So
It's great. Facebook for good. I like
yeah,
it.
exactly. Yeah.
Maybe it's a good time to wrap up? Or?
Yeah. Great.
Eva, thank you
Thank
so
you. My pleasure.